Well, welcome everyone to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series of podcasts in which we're aiming to gain insight through some incisive dialogue with some of the world's leading independent thinkers on matters related to digital technology. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO at Access Partnership and fairly well known, I think, for my willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and try and cut through the hype, which is exactly what we're going to do today. My guest today is Roslyn Layton. Roslyn is the Senior Vice President of Strand Consult and a visiting researcher at the Aalborg University in Copenhagen. She's an internet economist and she studies the impact of internet regulation across countries. She serves on the program committees of the International Telecommunications Society and of the Telecoms Policy Research Conference. She's a senior contributor to Forbes and she publishes very widely. And indeed, we've worked together on a number of articles and similar on topics mostly related to spectrum regulation. And it's regulation that I want to turn to today. It's a time where overall regulation seems to be on the increase, particularly in the area of digital. And it feels like there's ever more calls to rein in the powers of the digital giants, the Metas, the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, and the Apples. I don't think it's going to be any secret that both Roslyn and I believe a lot of regulation is inappropriate and other things like innovation can do a lot more. But what we're going to do today is try and talk through what the issue is, what the problem is, and try and cast some light on some of the problems and some of the best practices going on in this area. So I'm going to kick us off by asking, what is the problem here? Why are we trying to regulate? Why are we worried about what's happening in this space of digital when, on the face of it, we're getting a whole load of wonderful new services for very little cost? So Roslyn, what's your take on that?
Well, as we just start, first I want to say thank you, and it's an honor to join you on your Independent Thinkers podcast. I could not feel more at home than with such a community. So thank you for that. I feel so lucky to be a part of that and really say hello to all of your listeners and hope that they will continue looking for independent perspectives. So let's present something I think maybe that your listeners could appreciate, but maybe they didn't know the names or what have you. Talk about regulatory capture. George Stigler, right, is Nobel Prize economist, 1982, and he wrote really this very important discussion. And he said something perhaps we could accept, but it might be controversial, that, regulation is acquired by companies and operated for their benefit. So I think that we have one dominant narrative that it's sort of the state is controlling these enterprises that are running roughshod. But I might suggest to you that the industries and the companies themselves are looking for regulation as a way to enhance their business. Now, on the one hand, this is extremely rational. Why would you not want to find the right framework that works for your business? In fact, we could argue this about capitalist economies. Why does capital go to where it can get a good return? It absolutely makes sense. But what I think concerns me is how firms might use regulation to deter competition. And I would give you, perhaps to me, the most salient example that I know. If I look at Meta, and historically has been a huge force for bringing connectivity to people offline. And I think one of the most innovative programs was something called Free Basics, which was a way where Meta or Facebook, they crunched down their data. It used to be 14 megabits on the mobile phone. They brought it down to 1 megabit and then less than that. So they were so smart about saying, how do I code my data so it takes up as little as possible? Now, in India, you can imagine it's very hard to get online because, even then a few pennies is still a lot of money. But there was a campaign driven by Google to deter Facebook getting into the advertising marketplace in India under the guise that free Facebook is bad for poor people. And there was absolutely nothing to suggest that was the case. Billions of people use WhatsApp to connect with their families, for healthcare, for disaster relief, all of those things. And because Google wanted to deter the rollout of a new competitive platform, it used the political system to slow Facebook. So for me, that is the real concern that I'm about. I think Google's amazing. Facebook is amazing. All of these things, they're big because we use them. But my concern is the platforms in some ways are so big that they can distort the framework to their benefit. And so what I do, my colleagues do, what we're trying to do is to step back and say, what's going on here? Is it legitimately helpful for consumers, this particular regulation? How do we measure it? Can we independently say that's the case? Or is this something that's benefiting the firm at the expense of consumers?
And do you think it's starting to perhaps even backfire a bit against them now? So we've got this case right now in Europe where the European Telecommunications Network Organization, ETNO, has proposed what's sometimes called an over-the-top tax, the kind of concept that the big generators of traffic, the Googles and the Facebooks and others, should pay the mobile operators and the fixed operators for the carriage of that. And there's a lot of ongoing issues there. It feels like they're now being caught up in regulation that maybe they started to use as a tool themselves, and it's now coming back to backfire against them.
Right. Well, that's a very good point. And, I think that there's maybe another way to look at this. Not all data is equal to all people, in the sense there's some data we value more than others. And if we look at the social benefit situation, it could be that some of the most valuable data don't take up very much space at all. With WhatsApp communication, a disaster SMS or something like that, it's very different than a video. And so where I think Europe is today is that the regulation from going back to, let's say, the 2005 to around 2007, telecom regulation was all about low prices for consumers, right? Above all, we're going to get low prices for consumers. So squeezing the price that the telecom provider could get from the consumer. Now, what has been the impact of that? Less investment in networks. There's one figure as much as 300 billion. So there's a shortfall in Europe getting 5G and fiber to the home because we've squeezed the consumer side of it. Now, it appears that, it's not exactly clear what the other side of the market should be. What should the content providers pay? But we're now in this shortfall. And so that's what I think perhaps what was seen as the right thing to do in 2005. Here we are in 2023. And let's say we don't have the networks that we need. Now, we could also take your point. Maybe we don't need them. The data is not going as fast as we thought. We can take that point. But what I think regulators are within their time, they often don't realize the impact of their decision down the road or in other ways. So they said low prices are more important. Well, that comes at the sake of investment and innovation. We may want to have more investment and innovation. It may be more important to us than a low price. Alternatively, maybe we want more business models, and European regulation doesn't allow that either. So we're now in this point that maybe what we're suffering was the unintended consequence of decisions made 15 years ago.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I was at Ofcom, not looking at this specific question, but I sat on some of the boards there, and I remember this issue kind of coming up. And of course, the regulator says, "Well, we want something balanced. We want both low prices and we want investment," which of course they would say. But as you rightly said, everything seems to push more towards lower prices, particularly in Europe, and the net result is much less investment. Yeah. Less so, it seems to be in the US. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, Europe investment. Now we can take UK just to the side for a moment, but overall Europe is less than half of the US per capita investment. Now, of course, it's apples to oranges in the sense that the United States is essentially one market. If you have a national network, you have spectrum rights across the country, you get economies of scale, you have bigger distance to cover, that sort of thing. But there are certain things we've learned, as you know, the spectrum markets they work. I mean, you deliver a lot, companies will pay for the rights to use the spectrum. That goes to the Treasury. It took us a long time to accept that we should auction licenses for spectrum. So I think that Europe is coming to terms with that view that low prices are not everything. And by the way, it's not low prices. What I'm saying is flexible prices. I will give Ofcom some credit because in their latest proposal, what they've sort of said is consumers should be allowed to buy premium subscriptions, meaning there are people who might say, look, there are times, or maybe I want to pay more because I want a higher quality. I should be able to do that. There should not be a restriction on that. The ISPs should be able to sell that. And that high-end part, which is important, has sort of not been allowed because it was considered discriminatory or whatever, or the fast lane. And that's absolute nonsense. I mean, we could say, look, we're going to take this Zoom call or whatever. I want to make sure I have highest quality, for my Zoom call. And I'm willing to pay an extra dollar or pound or whatever the case may be. Or I just want to have a higher version, more secure, whatever the case may be. That high end has not been allowed. The other thing that's not been allowed and is going out of the way in Europe, unfortunately, is zero rating. And to me, I find it's the most anti-consumer policy because we want to encourage people to learn online, get healthcare online, do things to improve their lot online, and we're willing to make it free for them to do that. And during the pandemic, as you know, in UK, many people, 1 in 4, I think it's something, 1 in 5 children only had a smartphone at home, and they couldn't go to school. The only way they could do their learning was through the internet. And Ofcom had to intervene and suspend the rules in UK so that the kids can learn online. And that's not, and I think Ofcom, they realize that, and they want to have a system that works on both ends, both for the financially vulnerable, as well as to give freedom to those who would like to pay for additional capability that they can. So that's a kind of marketplace that's a very different one that says, look, all things, there's one size fits all. We're going to control it and make it all the same for everyone. One kind of subscription. It's very simple and easy. That actually ends up hurting most of the people because we all have different needs at different times, and that you actually have to have a variety of prices and bundles in the marketplace. And I think that scares regulators. It actually is more work for them because they feel like they have to oversee so much more and it's out of my control and that sort of thing. But a real marketplace is going to be that way. It is going to have different price points in different ways at different times.
Absolutely. And it almost seems incredible that you wouldn't have that if you look at everything else. I mean, it feels like the airline industry is restricted to only having one class of travel on a plane or something like that. It would all seem bonkers. So it's kind of almost hard to think, why did we get here? And I guess it sort of dates way back to the first net neutrality issues and the worry. I think this came out of the US when there was a worry that cable operators would only carry their own video content and would block the video content from other providers, and that there would be some kind of monopolization effect, which I'm sure was a valid worry at the time. But that was, as you said, 2005 or whatever, and we've moved on from there to a different world.
It was. That the prevailing speed, it was 3 megabits per second, and there was the concern, but here's the thing. We've had, quintillion, how much data we've had since then. I cannot think of, any application that every single application has flourished, right? There was no kind of telecom going in and saying, I'm going to strangle Skype. So that debate is over. The question, so that's no longer the question anymore. That was a very salient idea at the time. It was easy to make out the telecoms as the boogeyman, and we put in all of that regulation to control the telecom. But unfortunately, that has hurt consumers because it's limited their choice. They should have more choice. And so now I think that's what regulators, certainly Ofcom realizes that it might have been fine at one time, but it's no longer helpful, and that consumers are being harmed today.
So why is it taking regulators so long to realize this and to act upon it? Because it seems so obvious, and as you rightly say, Ofcom are now doing something, but it feels like even that is way too late, and other regulators seem mired. You mentioned kind of complexity. I certainly have seen that in my time in regulators. There's a worry if it gets too complex, it's hard to manage. Right. But they're intelligent people. Surely they can see there's an issue here.
Right. So this is the political. So I think what is regulation today? It has a political element because there will be a political constituency. One industry or another wants a certain regulation, so you deliver that to pay the political rents to that particular and to that constituency. then times change and then the constituencies change. And then you go back and say, well, we're no longer served. The constituent wants something new, or finally the economists get a turn. And they can demonstrate over time. I mean, we'll see these things over time. You can see the trends. I mean, I also think that, we have, let's say in Europe, where we think everyone should have access to 5G and fiber to the home as a political goal. We can't get there, right, unless we change the policy. And we also realize the policy that we had before, which everyone said was great, or the politicians said were great, turns out it wasn't great. So they don't want to admit that they were flawed. So that's first of all, people don't want to admit they're wrong, because then, well, then are you wrong again? So that is one issue. I would like to say, I teach regulation in Aalborg University, and we teach a kind of classical model, which is very rare, but basically it's a linear process where you start in a state of monopoly and you get to competition. So you had a state-owned telephone company with one service, and then you privatize the entity. You should get two firms, maybe more at the end, but in a certain period of years, not very long. Then you return the resources of the telecom regulator back to the Treasury, and then they do the next thing. But today, the telecom regulation has become the end in itself, and it becomes a sort of ongoing. So what do I reinvent my agency for? Well, I need to regulate speech, and I need to regulate, the outcomes and the diversity and this, that, and the other. Again, this might be that the parliament say we want the regulator to do that, but it is also mediated with a political opportunity. I mean, I just want to mention one thing, I think, to show a difference between US and UK, is I think you pointed it out. In the United States, we can look at Federal Communications Commission. It has 5 commissioners, which are put in their place by political party. So whichever political party has the presidency gets 3, and then the other side gets 2. They're approved by the Senate. That's not a system that UK is using an arm's length, is going to use a different process. So there was a view in the United States that if we could keep a bipartisan share, that somehow we'd get a politically consistent decision. But so much of the decisions will be mediated by the political party. That has very little to do with what's evidently economically good for consumers or innovation or so on. It's really what works politically. So maybe it's transparent, but I think that is important to know, because this has little to do with economics. This has very much to do with perhaps political economy or political science.
I agree, absolutely. And I think that's a change that I've seen over the last 10 years or so, particularly in the world of mobiles. If I go back more than 10 years, I think most countries were just interested really in a nice competitive world, because they could see that was causing a rollout quite quickly of mobile. Now we've got to a situation where the rollout has probably stopped or nearly come to a halt in terms of expanding the area. Politicians want that to be bigger, because why wouldn't they? That looks good, particularly if you're in a constituency that's rural, then you're going to want to try and show your constituents you're acting on their behalf. But also there's this kind of impression now for politicians that you need to be ahead in the game of 5G or fiber, because if you're not, if you drop down that league table, there's going to be some horrible detrimental outcome to your country that's going to cause great loss of GDP. And like all these things, I'm sure there's some truth in that. There's been plenty of studies that have shown that broadband penetration does have an impact on GDP growth. So it's not that's clearly a fallacy. But it does feel like it's been pushed too far. And we've now got a world where essentially the politicians are saying, we must have much, much better coverage. The operators are saying, well, we can't do that without more money. And then you get we'll get the digital giants to pay for it. None of which, as you say, is really linked to economics, or even really to a definite consumer need that's clearly been identified and proven. And that whole process feels like it's sort of running out of control a bit at the moment to me.
If we want to fast forward, and you and we've talked about this, and we can look at your articles in Fierce Wireless and, on Forbes, where it is a bit out of control because we have different government agencies fighting each other, and even the FCC being held hostage. So its authority to conduct the spectrum is not being reauthorized. And you have the aviation interests and the space interests and everyone else fighting over what should be, who gets the pie. Now, you can resolve those things. There are ways and processes to do that. It also takes some leadership. But there is a battle in the sense that the different industries will use the political system to get what works for them. And I think just to come back to your original question, what this is all about is which industry is what wins. And I would say it doesn't necessarily have to do what's best for consumers. It's whichever industry can put forth the most salient argument or succeed to get the political system on its side. Sometimes it works for consumers. I think many times it has, but I could certainly argue we have now holdouts, which are not good in the sense that FCC spectrum authorization authority is being held up, because let's say cable industry doesn't want to see, wireless, mobile wireless go forward. I mean, that is, that's not good for anyone. In long term, it's not good for the cable industry. I mean, if anything, what the cable industry should be happy about is a tremendously competitive market. There's a broadband, so many different ways you can get broadband in the United States. And so this whole notion that it was a cable monopoly, that's nonsense. You can get broadband through, fixed wireless today. We have highest fiber to the home we've ever had in the US. You've got satellite has become much faster. So there's, in many respects, I wish it would be that the different broadband providers would recognize that, in fact, when there's competition, it should be an opportunity to lessen the regulation, right? Because the market is in fact working.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and I see that lobbying all the time, and it does feel like the groupings that manage to get that act together and do that better are getting more of a say than they should do. And to go back to the over-the-top tax in Europe, arguably it's the fact that the mobile operators as a community have managed to coalesce, and they've been able to do that because they have a body like the GSMA and others that allows them to get together and to kind of put their argument quite forcefully by paying organisations to write appropriate reports and feed that into the European politicians. And I don't know, but I'm guessing that also those organisations are good at lobbying those politicians directly. I would imagine they are.
Yeah.
Whereas we look at the Googles and the Apples and so on, they're hugely powerful companies, but they haven't really they don't have their own trade body really that allows them to argue back fully. And maybe that will happen as a result of this effect. But that all feels that's inherently wrong, isn't it? That essentially what you get is dominated by how well you manage to organise your industry faction.
Yes. I would say in some ways I do see the platforms do organize well on certain things. At least in the United States, there's a group called Encompass where, CCIA, where you have, the largest tech firms. And they're not monolithic. I mean, if you look at the long tail, you have an Airbnb and an Uber and Adobe and Salesforce. They're not the same things as, maybe Microsoft, right? They're all very different. And so it's hard to characterize them. And I don't think there's one trade association that probably looks at all their interests.
Yeah.
And you can certainly, as we've seen, they are not all on the same page about what they're looking for, right? They may, and there are definitely times when they want to partner across different industries. So, we could look at it and say, well, why aren't they more organized or so on? I mean, the interesting thing is that this is all explained by Mankur Olson and his, logic of collective action. There's lower costs for a small group to organize, a small cohesive group than a large diffuse group.
Yeah.
Where I think it's most shown is consumers. There's no real consumer lobby because every consumer wants different things. What we have on the consumer side is sort of self-asserted consumer organizations who claim to represent the consumer, but are basically aligned with one industry or another. They're not representing what would be legitimately consumer interests. And even, I would say, European Union funds a consumer union, which is just a mouthpiece for whatever EU policy that is popular at that time. So I think, if anything, independent thinkers, we're trying to think for ourselves and figure out, there's nothing wrong with the lobbying in itself in the sense that you need to have organization and policy and these things move forward. But we just want to understand, be transparent about the costs and benefits, right? So, I think if we look at Europe, there's certainly a shortfall. And then the question is, how best, there's got to be, maybe there's some combination there that we're going going to loosen both sides of the market, that there would be some more flexibility to do better pricing, higher end pricing, lower end pricing, more bundles. And then maybe on the other side, there can be loosening in the sense that small and medium-sized content providers, they want to have access to more capabilities that they don't get today. So, I think there's room on both sides to get to, a happy medium.
So I think we've got a fairly good grasp of the problem. How do we solve it, though? I'm trying to think if there's any equivalent in different industries where there's been very strong lobbying groups and there's been somehow a pushback away from them, or an ability for the regulator to avoid excessive capture. I can't immediately think of anything, but
sure. Well, actually, we have something. I'm going to go back to the U.S. here for a moment. In the founding, under the Federalist Papers, James Madison, he actually outlined this notion about there's always going to be factions. And in fact, the whole idea of America at the time was you could create your faction. You would align with your countrymen for your particular interest. And that was, you had the freedom to assemble, and that was important. So I think for me, the issue is just the transparency, that we should allow this kind of thing, but we need to be transparent. And I think regulators should be critical in the sense that, and again, you worked at Ofcom. So, For example, I think Ofcom, they held a discussions of late where they try to bring together different stakeholders and sort of prod and see, what do you really think? And then it's all there for everyone to see. So I think in many respects that our digital technologies enable more transparency, which is wonderful. We can watch the video proceedings. We can see the submissions, the ex partes, and so on, at Ofcom. That is tremendously valuable. Now, of course, I don't assume everybody takes their Friday night and is downloading the Ofcom submissions, on whatever proceeding they're doing. But it's there. It's there for journalists. It's there for the public. And that is a very valuable. And internet has given us that tremendous capability. I only see us going in that direction. So there is accountability as well, because for those of us who follow this, we will go back and see, well, why did you make that decision? And I would say not all regulatory agencies have that same transparency. Fortunately, I think some telecom regulators are doing that. I think Barrett could probably do a bit better on it. A lot of it seems that it's a little bit behind closed doors. And I'd say the unfortunate part as well, that the privacy regulations in EU allow different parties to mask their meetings and submissions. So people can simply say, oh, I'm just not going to make it public. I'm going to redact it. So we don't know. Anyway, it's not perfect, but I'm positive about the direction in that respect. I don't know if there's any, to me, it's all about if the factions, we can see who's talking, that will help us. And I'm encouraged that we have users who are interested to learn, because I think they want to go beyond just whatever's written in the media that day. They think there's got to be more to the story, that they're not, so you have that capability to go to the regulator's website and see, well, wait, who's active in this proceeding? I'd like to see for myself.
Yeah. And to some degree, this is blowing our own trumpet, but it feels to me that there's not enough independence out there. So too often a newspaper or whatever will think, I need to interview somebody. Who will I interview? I know I'll go for the CEO of a big company because that's a big name. It'll look authoritative that I've approached X. And of course, those sort of individuals, very intelligent, I'm sure, but they're going to toe the company line, and they're going to be very cautious in what they say to a journalist. So it's kind of allowing a bit more of our sorts of voices out there somehow that can perhaps come at it from both sides and see both angles. And I hope that might happen, but every time I look at a conference program or whatever, I see this trend back towards picking the big names rather than the independent voices.
Well, I think as we've said before, podcasts in some way are filling that gap. And, I've certainly myself, I've worked in think tanks and we have, for example, the Forbes Contributor Network. We have hundreds of contributors because the sort of mainline view is not enough for most people. And I think if you're an educated person, you want to look past the talking heads. You want to say, well, let me go a little bit deeper. But a lot of this work falls on the individual person. You need to invest time, and you have to go, you need to invest time and look beyond. You need to use different sources to get the full picture of a story. Probably not possible to do on every issue, but there are certainly skills that are there, and we just have to do our part however we can. That
sounds right to me, and I certainly wasn't expecting that between us we would come up with a wonderful new solution to the problems that have existed since the time of the Federalist Papers.
Exactly.
But I think what we have said today, which has been fascinating, is first of all, there is a problem. The regulation that surrounds digital and telecoms is far from perfect, and we can pick on many pretty egregious examples of poor regulation that is just plainly nuts, and yet hasn't been changed yet. And there are many reasons for that, but one of the key ones perhaps is political intervention and politicians using regulation for their own aims, but also incumbents that want to use regulation as a competitive weapon against new entrants or against their other competitors. And both of those are distorting the views that the regulators get. And in some cases, the regulators are a bit hand-tied because their own governance is tied up with politics. And so they can't simply just push back and say, that's all rubbish. And so all of that is leading to a mix of a world where the regulation is far from optimum. And clearly it's very difficult to change such a world, apart from with some openness, as you rightly say, the ability for people to actually point to things and say, that decision is clearly silly, or there looks to be something very odd going on here that I wouldn't have expected. Why has this happened? And for us to try and do as much as we can to expose those issues and just keep niggling away at the regulators and others until hopefully we get some traction, some voices. Does that sound like a kind of
that is
what we got
exactly.
To?
It's a lifetime of work, and that's what we do every day. And I think our platforms are making it more possible all the time, which is great. And we're just continuing around the world to make our connections and get these messages out about being independent, thinking independently, thinking for oneself, challenging the prevailing orthodoxy, whatever it might be. And that's, I think, the best we can hope for.
And that sounds like a wonderful point to leave it. It's been a great conversation, Roslyn. As always, a real pleasure to interact with you. And thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Good luck.
Thank you.